Special thanks to Sega for sponsoring this video. If you were wondering why this video was out on the same day as a brand new game release, that would be why. I absolutely did not expect this, but I'm incredibly happy about this opportunity to deliver my thoughts to the audience like this, so a very massive thanks to Sega for that. Sonic the Hedgehog is on go mode these days when it comes to content output. Since 2021, there have been regular updates, new releases, re-releases, and backwards compatibility enhancements. This year, Sonic Frontiers has been getting a regular stream of updates that just concluded last month, and now we have the latest Sonic platformer, Sonic Superstars. This game was announced a few months back and was going to be the next classic Sonic-styled 2D platformer, more or less a spiritual successor to Sonic Mania from 2017, just not being developed by the Mania team. Instead, Sonic Superstars was developed by Arzest, the studio led by Naoto Oshima, character designer for Sonic 1 and the game director of Sonic CD back in the 90s. He hasn't been at Sega since 1999, but he and Takashi Iizuka, the head of Sonic Team, thought this would be a natural collaboration to bring the next 2D Sonic game to life. From the moment it was announced, I knew I'd probably end up playing it eventually and doing a video on it, but I can't say the hype was volcanic for me. That was because Sonic Mania was a game that, despite it being really well made, just never got me that excited. Of course, if you want more information, you can go watch the video I did on Sonic Mania last year. Generally speaking, this video will look at Superstars as a game and compare it heavily to the classic quadrilogy, Sonic Mania, and Sonic 4. So I'm gonna act as if you have at least seen those videos. The rest of the franchise doesn't matter too much for this video, even if I do bring up some of them from time to time. But as I was saying, Sonic Mania was a game that I thought was really good, I just never felt the strong urge to replay it much past its original release. And before my video on it, I was never even able to figure out why that was. But either way, as Superstars promos were coming out, I thought, yeah, this might be good, but we'll see if I end up loving it or not. Now that I got the chance to try it early, I want to use this video to answer the following questions. What did I think of Sonic Superstars? What can you expect from this game if you aren't familiar with it? And do I think it's worth the $60 price tag? So let's find out. Also, heads up, if you want to experience this game completely blind, I'm going to be talking about my experience with the entire game. I'm not trying to do a comprehensive deep dive where I spoil the entire game, but if you want a fresh experience, I figured I'd warn you that I'm going to talk about my playthrough of the whole game like pretty much all my other videos. But as I was saying, as is no doubt obvious, this game doesn't use the pixel art aesthetic of Sonic Mania and instead uses fully 3D models. Of all the games to use it, I think this is my favorite interpretation of classic Sonic in 3D that we've ever gotten. If you go back to my review of Sonic Generations from 2021, I had talked about how I liked the way classic Sonic's design was a combination of all the older Sonic artwork, and I think the artwork of Superstars maintains that appeal, but I also think they've done it in a way that, for the whole classic cast, is more expressive than before. And in-game, I think the animations have more appeal than Generations and especially Forces, as Sonic has a variety of poses and in-betweens. Sonic having the best animations of the playable roster, but I thought the characters looked really appealing in this game. The actual visuals, though, aren't anything mind-blowing. These kinds of 3D retro throwback games are usually not on the cutting edge of graphics and detailed environments. The closest comparison I can draw to how Superstars looks would be Mega Man 11 from 2018. It being a very similar kind of game with the retro game design and 3D graphics. Throughout this game, you'll see the background and foreground assets that are pretty basic and effects like lighting and shadows that also don't do much to wow a 2023 player, when a game like, say, Sonic Generations in terms of visuals and detail is far more cutting edge than this game. This is something I find pretty common in these types of games, but I thought it looked fine when it came to the technical elements. I played the game on PC and thus was able to play it at 4K, and I thought it looked pretty sharp on my monitor. However, I did get some load screens between stages when returning to the menu. I chalked that up to playing at 4K, but your mileage may vary on that. Where I was less impressed was the soundtrack. Sonic Superstars brought T. Lopes back from Sonic Mania to do the soundtrack alongside series veteran Jun Senoue. Despite that pedigree, I felt like the music in Superstars is one of the weaker ones in series history. The whole thing feels rather inconsistent since half the music is with T. Lopes' MIDI style from Sonic Mania, which people really loved in that game. Then the other half of the music sees Jun Senoue bring back those Sonic 4 Genesis sounding synths that people really didn't like in the Sonic 4 games. But now the soundtrack has two distinct styles, and it just felt out of place to me rather than like a collaboration. Plus, I thought the composition was catchier in Sonic Mania and even Sonic 4 than what Superstars goes for. Of course, there's an element of recency bias to saying I don't find the composition of new tracks as memorable as the ones from games I've been familiar with for years, but that's just how I felt about it. But to shift gears and get into the gameplay properly, I was pretty pleased with how this game played. Over the many decades, there have been many attempts to recreate the feeling of the Genesis Sonic titles. I would know. I've played and covered basically all of them. To start there, in series history, something was always traded off in doing a replica of the classic Sonic gameplay, whether that be the physics not being like the Genesis titles, the level design not being as intricate, or the gameplay going for something different inherently than the classic titles. This doesn't have to be a deal breaker since many of the later 2D Sonic games are really good in their own way. Sonic Advance 3 is one of my favorite Sonic games ever, despite the fact that it's not designed like the original games in many respects. But the one that did nail everything in its attempts to recreate the past was Sonic Mania. I'm happy to report that Superstars also got it right. They claimed in the pre-release that the original Sonic games were studied closely as reference material to ensure that they got the feel of playing classic Sonic right, even with the 3D graphics. This was not an empty promise. As early as the first stage, I thought that everything from starting to run, to jumping, to spin dashing felt exactly how I'd expect after all my countless hours in the original installments. You can do the things you could in those older games, like jump from a loop at the right angle for a huge boost in speed and jump off of inclines at a high speed to go really high in the air. The movement felt absolutely perfect in this game with every playable character. On that subject, when you first start the game, you can choose between playing as Sonic, Tails, Amy, and Knuckles. In the single player, you cannot have an AI partner character like you could in multiple previous installments, which is probably a good thing given how that's been a leading cause of frustration in some specific moments of prior 2D games. You're also not locked into playing as one character for the entire playthrough, though. In Superstars, you'll complete a stage and get the option to either play the next level with the character you're currently playing as, or you can return to the world map where you can play the previous levels or enter the shop to buy cosmetics for the multiplayer component or switch characters for the main game. They did a really good job balancing the playable roster in this game. All 4 characters play the exact same when it comes to controls. They all jump into a ball and can spin dash, so in terms of basics, no character has an obvious advantage. But each character has something unique that makes them worthwhile. Sonic has the drop dash that was first introduced in Sonic Mania that's become a mainstay of the series ever since. This made him my favorite character to play as because you jump in the air, rev up, and can go flying as soon as he touches the ground. It's great for instantly picking up speed from a standstill. Being able to pick up a lot of speed is important to me as a player of 2D Sonic, so the drop dash made Sonic my favorite, but the others are good too. Tails and Knuckles have the exact same extra abilities they've always had. Tails can fly into the air, which makes exploring with him a little easier, and Knuckles can glide and climb walls, which does the same and is useful in finding hidden passageways and such. For Amy, they had to come up with something new though. I think it's pretty cool to see Amy's been worked in as a core part of the classic Sonic crew, since she was never actually playable in any of the platformers from the 90s. But making Amy playable in 2D and 3D has seen a lot of different approaches over the years. Some liked how Amy in a game like Sonic Advance was very different from the main trio, being much slower and being unable to roll into a ball. It essentially made her the character to play as if you wanted the toughest experience. But I think simpler is better, so I appreciate how Sonic Superstars came up with a moveset for Amy that worked for the character while also still following the regular Sonic mold. As I said, she can do all the basic moves the others can do and is granted a double jump and the ability to use her hammer as a sort of offensive shield while doing so. I thought this was pretty useful whenever I played as Amy. Now, all that is fine and good, but good controls and characters are nothing if the game doesn't have fun levels, so how does Superstars fare in that regard? Well, I wasn't sure what to expect with this one. The reason is that this is a game that was marketed around it being a 4-player co-op experience. In a slower-paced 2D platformer, co-op gameplay can be a chaotic but fun addition to a solid game. In Sonic, it has just never really been that before. Sure, you could pick up the second controller and play as Tails in Sonic 2 and 3, but player 1 would just outrun them and they'd be unable to actually do anything. But 4 whole players at once in 2D Sonic just sounded crazy. I worried that the level design would be a lot simpler than the heights of the actual classic games to accommodate a multiplayer experience, to the detriment of the single player. But thankfully I was wrong about this. I played through the game twice, once on a fresh file, and then a second time with everything unlocked. And never during my playthrough did I feel like multiplayer forced the team to compromise in the actual levels. I'm not going to definitively declare how the levels stack up to the classic games because we've all been playing them for decades at this point, so we've seen all they have to offer and what the best routes are and all that other stuff that comes from repeat playthroughs and analysis. What I will tell you is that I thought the levels consistently provided rewarding moments of speed and platforming and that the stages all had multiple routes. Higher ones took more skill or knowledge to get to, and I felt like I was rewarded for curiosity by finding these tokens you use at the shop or by finding special stage rings like Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Speaking of which, this game features totally original special stages. The goal of them is reaching the Chaos Emerald, like always, but you need to grapple onto and swing around in these spheres to get closer to the Emerald, which is flying around the arena. It's pretty easy to pick up and play, which a good special stage should be, and when you fail, you feel like it's something you could have avoided. The ring count is your timer, and you extend it by collecting these ring clusters, giving you the choice between going after rings for more time or just gunning for the Emerald. These are compelling design choices, and for that reason I thought the special stages were fun breaks from the game and not pace breakers. You don't have the option to retry special stages like Sonic 4 or the Sonic Origins collection, so there's also some tension here too. If you want to try again, you need to start the level again, which I thought was a fair trade-off. The only thing I didn't like was that I felt like the auto-targeting on the spheres was a little finicky sometimes, but not to a super detrimental degree. This game gives you more reward for collecting the emeralds than ever before, as each emerald comes with its own superpower. Think of the Wisps in Sonic Colors as a good comparison. The Emerald powers in Superstars give you temporary moves you can use to enhance your mobility, but to my surprise, these powers were far better than any Wisp ever was. You select the power-up you want to use in this wheel and then activate it, and you can then use it until the meter runs out, and the meter is refilled when you cross a checkpoint. A lot of these were super handy, like the red one that gives you multiple jumps that are good for mobility, and they also save your life in a bind. The green one lets you ride on a vine into the sky, which is a godsend in exploration. The blue one sends all these clones of the player character all over the screen, which is super powerful on boss fights, which, believe me, is important. Other ones are more situational, but you will make use of just about all the power-ups. Except for the white one, which is the last emerald you get. It gives every character a unique move, but having all 7 also activates super forms for everyone, which is considerably more exciting than, say, a homing attack for Sonic. But this discussion of power-ups and special stages was an aside to the point I was making about levels, so let's return to that. Where they truly rank in the hierarchy of 2D Sonic level design is something I feel I'd need time and perspective to really say, but for now, I thought the game's stages were good. Since I was pleasantly surprised by the single-player content, I wish I could tell you about the multiplayer, but I cannot. Fans should definitely know that this game's campaign does not have an online multiplayer, it's couch co-op only. Sonic 4 Episode 2 had online play, and I get it was pretty messy sometimes, but I feel like this game just being a better built game would naturally make it suit online more. There is online play in these battle mode things, but I didn't really try much of that out because dedicated side modes for multiplayer are things I tend to ignore when playing most games. Before the game released, I remembered some fans expressing disappointment at the level themes, however I always thought they seemed fine to me. Many fans are tired of Green Hill Zone getting reused over and over again, and thus, people felt like the first level of this game, Bridge Island Zone, is just more of the same. But I thought the blue tones and waterfalls were enough to feel pretty fresh. And then, throughout the game, I thought the ideas were pretty cool. For example, Pinball Carnival Act 2 was a level I thought was pretty creative. Pinball machines and carnivals are nothing new in Sonic, but this one has a Halloween theme to it which just adds an extra spice to the stage that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Many tropes have been in Sonic games before, however I just feel like the ones in Superstars did enough new and interesting in terms of level design or visual design or both to feel new. The level design has a lot of moments I really enjoyed. Pinball Carnival sees you get on these rides that go at breakneck speed and you need to jump to different ones to survive, which I thought was pretty fun to play. Same for Speed Jungle, where Sonic just blasts forward on these vines and you can jump off for huge height. Or these snakes let you do the same in Sand Sanctuary. What is definitely noteworthy is how the pacing is a bit uneven throughout the game though. Many zones are the usual length for Sonic, 2 acts per zone. But then there are some with optional third acts where you play as an exclusive character. For example, Speed Jungle has 2 regular acts where you play as any character you want, but an exclusive Sonic level where you fight Fang. Lagoon City has an Amy exclusive level that I was actually made to play by the game where you bash your way through giant fruit like it's Sonic Lost World on Wii U, and then piggyback the new character Trip for the second half of the stage. While having extra stages is welcome, I thought it was a bit uneven in the pacing department, especially because there are some zones that only get 1 act instead of 2. Sky Temple, Sand Sanctuary, and Cyber Station are all examples of that. They don't have hidden stages, they're just 1-act zones. But the confusing thing was that the 1-act zones are some of the longest levels in the game. All of these took me over 6 minutes to beat the first time, which makes you wonder, why not just make it 2 acts with normal runtimes then? But it's also not a big deal because it would be the same amount of content, I just find the way they divided up the zones to be strange. Longer levels won't be a hassle for players though, because this game does not have a live system. Whether or not lives are a thing essential to the challenge of games, or just a dated relic from a bygone age, has been a thing game players have been discussing for years and years, but I think it mostly comes down to preference. I feel like they aren't needed anymore, and games can be designed to be challenging in organic ways without artificial limits on how much you can continue to play, and I thought Superstars kept me on my toes throughout the game without lives and game overs, so I'd actually prefer that. In fact, I probably would have gotten pretty annoyed if they were in the game, so I'm glad they aren't, but in the interest of fairness, this is the kind of issue where it comes down to your preference in game design, not hard lines of good and bad. Infinite lives proved very useful in the game's boss fights, which were easily the lowlight of the game for me. When it came down to the levels and mechanics, I was into this game, but the bosses were something I could easily point to as something I didn't, and I can sum it up in one word: waiting. This was also my biggest issue with the boss fights in Sonic 4 Episode 2, and Superstars is similar. I'm not saying that bosses were the strongest element of Sonic throughout its history, because bosses in the older 2D games were usually easy to dispose of or more pattern-oriented. In Superstars, the boss fights are very pattern-oriented, and some of those ideas are pretty cool, like Speed Jungle where you have to maneuver around to get Eggman to attack himself with these claws that come out of the walls. But the invisibility frames on bosses are so long that it really brings the pace down as the bosses take too many hits to defeat. This is a game-wide thing for both mini-bosses and regular bosses. You can see how they came up with a cool concept to revolve a boss around, but for single player, I just feel like the waiting periods in boss battles were my least favorite parts. The mother of all examples is in Golden Capital, where you have to face Fang in an auto-scroller that goes on for over 3 minutes, and I died like 2 or 3 times in the first go, which was easily my least favorite part of the entire game. And that's the thing with this, I wondered, well, why did they design it like that? And I realized this was probably a result of the game being multiplayer, same for Episode 2 of Sonic 4. If you design bosses like the classic games and you have 4 players on the screen, the boss would end in 2 seconds tops. So these pattern-based bosses create more chaos in the multiplayer and require players to work together and strategize. An element of the game not present if you're just playing by yourself like I was. For that reason, I just wish there was rebalancing done for single player, I guess. But then the endgame wasn't my favorite either. Frozen Base Act 2 is an homage to the game Fantasy Zone over having another full stage, which is neat if you get the reference, but it just made for a level I wouldn't want to replay, you know? Then in Egg Fortress, you play a longer level for Act 1 and then play it in reverse for Act 2. But I'll say this, the boss of this level was a decent challenge, even if it shared some issues with the other ones. I just thought it felt decently climactic, and I enjoyed conquering that challenge as the game came to an end. After you beat the game, you unlock some cool stuff, such as Trip as an extra playable character in the main campaign, and she gets her own remixed version of the campaign that's accessible from the options too, plus all the other modes I mentioned before. But with all that said, this begs the question, how did I feel about the game overall? Well, I liked it. I mean, the video has made this clear. I was pretty impressed by how the game played, I really liked using the new power-ups, and I thought the special stages were original, the level themes were interesting, and the playable characters were all fun to make use of. If I was just looking at the game in a vacuum, I'd say it was pretty good, barring the few things I didn't like as much. But I still felt like the experience was enjoyable, and I was having fun throughout the best stages. However, if we're talking about how much I recommend Sonic Superstars, if you're a die-hard Sonic fan, well, you're probably going to buy the game anyway, but if you haven't yet and are in that demographic, I think you'll enjoy it. But if you aren't convinced of this game for whatever reason, like any point that I've made thus far, or just how many games are coming out this year, Black Friday and the Christmas season are right around the corner, so I'd imagine the game is going to go on sale, and if it does, I'd say most probably get a kick out of this game, because as I said, I thought it was fun at the end of the day, which is all that matters, I suppose. And I think it's easy enough to pick up and play that anybody could enjoy this with their friends and family. So yeah, I thought this game was pretty decent, and I think most enjoyers of retro platformers would feel the same. But that's pretty much all I have to say on the game for the current moment. So to close, I would like to, again, thank Sega for the opportunity to cover this game upon its release, and to the audience, I would like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.